So good morning, everyone, again. I'm a security researcher from New York. This is a picture from the place that gave rise to my professional career in computer security. 17 years ago, I worked at the world-known research institute. My research involved collecting large data sets at the electron level and processing the data sets to reconstruct complex molecular interactions. This is a picture of particle accelerator near the building where I used to work. One night, as I was crunching some numbers in the lab, I noticed something suspicious with one of the systems. And as I began investigating, I found out that a hacker had compromised the system and was trying to exfiltrate sensitive data. And just to give you a perspective on the type of data stored in the systems, one of the scientists in the lab went on to receive a Nobel Prize several years later. So I tried to stop the attack by installing backdoors that were installed in the system and by erasing the data that the hacker had accumulated for exfiltration. That night, I went home thinking I did a great job. I got rid of the hacker. Well, I was wrong. The hacker got very upset with my actions. And on my return to the lab the following day, I had found out that the attacker had erased or reformatted the drive where I had collected my data the previous night, and the data had not been backed up yet. So that day, I learned that there were various types of threats that had to be anticipated in advance. I went on to learn about computer hacking techniques, eventually turning it into a professional career of a pen tester. And I'm sure the hacker went on to improve his ways on staying stealthy on the systems. Fast forward to today, computer security breaches are occurring on a much larger scale. And the key to minimizing the exposure in the event of a breach is to anticipate all the threats in advance. As we take the leap into the world of software-defined networking, I wonder what the threat landscape is going to look like for software-defined networking. And this is what my presentation is going to be about. I will talk about attack surface for SDN, and I will present the SDN threat model that could allow enterprises to anticipate SDN threats in advance. Software-defined networking, the topic of software-defined networking has attracted a great deal of attention from service providers and enterprises. Just to give some statistics here, Gartner did a study in 2014, and according to the study, 10,000 enterprises worldwide will have deployed SDN in their networks by 2016. Another study by Gartner, done in 2014, shows that 75% of the companies planned on SDN deployments in the next 5 years. International Data Corporation reports that the worldwide SDN market will reach over $8 billion by 2018. Software-defined networking holds great promise in terms of simplifying network deployment and management. However, there are a number of challenges that have to be addressed during the initial stages of SDN adoption. First of all, transition to SDN will require simultaneous support of traditional networks and software-defined networks. Not all enterprises will continue to fight security issues in traditional networks, but also will be dealing with security vulnerabilities in multiple SDN networks, as SDN simplifies rollout of multiple virtual networks on top of one physical infrastructure. So overall, such architecture will increase the risk for enterprises. Secondly, a lot of vendors are jumping right now on the SDN bandwagon by quickly developing SDN products so they can put them out there in the market space. With such hurry comes a significant concern that security could be left behind. Again, we should expect an increased number of vulnerabilities in the first wave of SDN products. Unfortunately, our current knowledge on SDN vulnerabilities, threats, and attacks is limited. All we can do is to anticipate the threats. But how do we do that? Well, enterprises should take a systematic, structured approach to SDN threat identification. One way of doing that is through threat modeling. Threat modeling is not going to eliminate the attacks. However, it will help enterprises to increase the level of preparedness in the event of attacks. To that end, I wanted to contribute to the community by developing a novel SDN threat model. Threat modeling requires understanding of all the systems and components, interfaces involved in SDN architecture. So this slide represents a typical SDN architecture. The architecture is composed of several planes and interfaces. The bottom line plane is the data plane that hosts network elements that transmit and process traffic. The plane is connected to the controller plane via southbound interface. The controller plane hosts controllers. Controllers manage the network elements, but also communicate with each other to synchronize network-specific information. The controller plane is then connected to the topmost plane, application plane, that hosts applications that will be accessing the resources, network resources through the controller plane. All these planes could be managed by an operations and support plane, the management plane. Any of the systems within the planes and interfaces may contain vulnerabilities. Therefore, the entire SDN attack surface is going to be the sum of all the vulnerabilities and threats within these planes and interfaces. To systematically identify threats in software-defined networks, I decompose threats into three elements. The threat source that triggers a vulnerability in SDN, vulnerability source, it's an SDN component that where the vulnerability arises. I'm sorry, the slides are a little cut off, so you probably not see. And finally, the threat action, by which a threat is carried out. So let's discuss each of these elements in a little more details. Threat sources. Threats may come from external systems outside of the typical SDN architecture. Threats may also originate from rogue systems that pretend to be part of a legitimate architecture, but they're really not. And finally, threats may come from the SDN-specific systems. Management console, applications, controllers, network elements. They may be either compromised by attacker, or it could be a legitimate user who is trying to engage in unauthorized activities. As I have previously mentioned, vulnerabilities may be found in various SDN systems, management consoles, applications, controllers, network elements, but also the interfaces connecting these systems. To define threat actions, I use a definition by NIST. A threat is any event with potential to adversely impact organizational operations and assets through an information system via unauthorized access, destruction, disclosure, or modification of information and or denial of service. Therefore, I define 5 types of threat actions. Unauthorized access is when a threat source accesses an SDN system which it doesn't have access to. Unauthorized disclosure, when the threat source accesses information that it's not authorized to access. Unauthorized modification of SDN information, again, for which the threat source is not authorized to modify. Disruption of service may occur in SDN system to prevent SDN system from functioning. Unauthorized destruction of SDN information with systems is also a threat. Putting all the threat sources, threat actions, and vulnerability sources together, I obtained many-to-many relationships between the threat sources, threat actions, and vulnerability sources. Each relationship represents a potential attack path, starting at some threat source, taking a threat action against the vulnerability source. There are the total of 240 threats in this model. Some of the threats are purely conceptual and unlikely to materialize into realistic dangers, but some of the threats actually may have a serious impact on SDN networks. So in the next few slides, I'm going to show you a few threat examples that could be derived from the model. These are the threat scenarios that we will be discussing. I would like to point your attention to the fact that some of these threats have an iterational, taken in iterations. For instance, a threat source exploits vulnerability and takes control of an SDN system and uses the system to exploit the vulnerability in another SDN system. This is an example of unauthorized access threat. An attacker is launching an attack against a management console. The attacker is on an external system and is trying to conduct a password brute forcing a password guessing attack against the management console. If the attacker is successful in taking over the management console, he may further conduct attacks on other systems on SDN networks. This is another example of unauthorized access threat. In this case, the attacker had already taken over the management console and trying to exploit a software vulnerability to achieve unauthorized access to the application. This is an example of disclosure of information threat. The attacker is engaging into the RAM scraping attack. In a traditional RAM scraper attack, the attacker first takes control over the application server and scans its memory, physical memory, to identify, extract sensitive information. In this example, the attacker took over the application server and is scanning the memory of that server to extract sensitive information. That could be, for instance, network flow rules that have been previously sent to the controller. Another example of a disclosure of information threat. Controllers provide application programming interfaces to the applications to make use of the network information available to the controllers. The interfaces may contain vulnerabilities that could be exploited by attackers. In this case, the attacker exploits a vulnerability to harvest information about network flow rules. Likewise, an attacker may exploit a vulnerability in the interface to delete network flow rules of the controller. This would be an example of unauthorized destruction threat. An attacker who took over an application but has limited privileges on the application, may try to escalate the privileges by exploiting a software vulnerability in the application. So this is an example of unauthorized access threat. So finally, the attacker took over the application. He has the admin rights. He looks at the application, and he realizes that this is a network tapping application. So the application is able to observe the flows traversing the network. The attacker is looking at the communications between two controllers. If these communications happen to be unencrypted and sent in clear text, the attacker is able to extract sensitive configuration data and may further use it to launch attacks on the SDM network. Unauthorized modification threat. The attacker uses the information obtained in the previous attack to set up a raw controller and is trying to conduct an identity spoofing attack by inserting new network flow rules into the network element. This attack could result in traffic flowing in the attacker's direction. An example of disruption of service threat. Let's go back to the management console the attacker had already taken control of. He may use that system to exploit software vulnerabilities to cause denial of service. For instance, in the controller, controllers have services running on open ports. An attacker may send requests to the controller pretending to be a network switch by overflowing the controller's table containing the switch information. For instance, the data structures that contain this information may not do the proper input validation. The controller may become unresponsive and eventually may even crash. Similarly, an attacker may launch an exploit vulnerability in the network element by overflowing the network flow table on the network element and causing the network element to become responsive. Example of disclosure of information threat. An attacker here is trying to determine if a flow rule already exists on the network element via side channel attack. An attacker sends a request to establish a connection to a system on the network and measures the amount of time it took to establish the connection. Then the attacker sends another request to establish another connection and times that request as well. Then the attacker compares 2 times that it took to establish the 2 connections. If the time, the second time, is less than the first time, then it means that the network flow rules just have been installed on the network elements and previously did not exist. Disruption of service threat. The attacker took over the network element. The network element becomes malicious. The attacker is trying to use the network element to flood the controller with network-specific messages. Unauthorized modification threat. Again, the network element had been compromised and the attacker is trying to poison the controller's view of the network topology by sending some rogue information that is known to the network element. So these are just a few examples of the threats and attacks that could be derived from the model I have developed. Each enterprise could use the model to determine what specific threats present the major risk to the network and use the identified threats to specify security requirements to address the threats and implement mitigation measures. Just to give you an example how you would proceed with this exercise, for instance, the threat is that the attacker is conducting login attempts or password browsing attempts against the management console. So the security requirement would be the management console should not allow an attacker to successfully launch a password brute forcing attack against the management console. Mitigation measures would be that all vendor default passwords for management console should be changed. A few security recommendations at the high level to address the threats that I have presented in my presentation. As far as the network configuration go, always separate sensitive critical system, put them in a trusted network segment, separated from the untrusted networks. All SDN-specific user accounts, default passwords should be changed, as well as strong password complexity requirements should be followed for these accounts. Limiting the number of SDN-specific accounts would help as well. The less SDN accounts you have, the less likelihood that your account will be compromised. As with traditional system, patching the systems should be done in a timely manner. All the communication channels should be protected using strong encryption. And the application plane, all applications should be developed using secure coding guidelines. At the controller plane, limit the number of services and ports that are open to outside systems. Again, the more services you're running, the more likelihood that they would get exploited. Implement high availability architecture for controllers. If one controller is subject of denial of service, another controller should be able to pick up. Implement integrity checks on the controllers to detect unauthorized modifications. And also implement rate limiting and packet dropping on the controllers to prevent denial of service attacks. At the data plane, all rule inserting activities or rule generating activities should be controlled. And the network flow rules should be verified against the controllers to identify discrepancies. I would like to conclude my presentation with a few Black Hat sound bites. So this is the threat I have not anticipated. The topmost and the bottommost portion of the slide is cut out. I should have, but. So use the presented SDN threat model to anticipate threats in your SDN designs and networks. I have developed, as I said previously, for the security community. So this is, you can use that. The model allows for easy derivation of security requirements and mitigation measures to increase the state of preparedness in the event of an attack. If you think that the architecture that I have presented is not necessarily what you have in your SDN designs, you may further extend it by incorporating specific details of your SDN implementations, designs. But also, by virtue of being a professional pen tester, I think that this model could be a very good foundation for planning and carrying out SDN penetration tests. So if the company is performing a pen test on your SDN network, you may use the SDN threat model to discuss the threats that have been covered by pen tests. Thank you very much for your time. With that, I'd like to take questions from the audience. Where in my model the configuration files would be stored? Is that the question? Well, configuration files could be found on any of the systems. Let's say the controller has configuration files. The configuration files, depending on the type of the attack that is being launched, It could be launched from within the controller. It could be launched from an external system outside of the controller. So if we're talking about configuration files that are being accessed inside the controller, then these files could be subject to the 5 threats actions that I have showed. So the files could be modified, unauthorized modification. The files could be subject of unauthorized disclosure, could be destruction. So that would be a circular type of attack, control against the controller with the local user engaged in the attack. So the type of threats you are discussing, first of all, that system that you are talking about is not in this model, but it could have been added there. And then you are talking about threats that would be applicable from within the system itself. So you can decompose the system that stores the code into further components, and similarly perform the identical, in similar fashion could perform threat modeling for those components. But such system could be, in my model, could be referenced to as an application server. So if you have any further questions, I can take them outside.